You know, one of the biggest turning points, the moment things start to really shift, is when you realize that the power dynamic you thought existed was never real. For so long, it can feel like the avoidant has the upper hand. They seem unbothered, they pull away, create distance, and somehow you're always the one left wondering what happened, what went wrong, what you could have done differently. It feels like they've got all the control, like they're the ones steering the connection, deciding when it intensifies and when it fades. And if you're emotionally invested, that can be incredibly destabilizing. But here's the truth, and once you really get this, everything changes. That sense of control they project, it's not power, it's not strength, it's not emotional mastery, it's a wall, it's self-protection. Avoidants aren't in control, they're avoiding control being taken from them. They fear intimacy not because they don't crave it, but because it makes them feel exposed, so instead of leaning in, they retreat. They disappear into silence, they withhold affection, not because they don't care, but because caring terrifies them. And yet, when we don't understand this dynamic, we interpret their distance as confidence. We think they must be so secure, so indifferent, so above it all. That illusion of emotional detachment makes you chase. It makes you feel like you're not enough, like you have to prove your value just to get crumbs of their attention. But when you see it for what it is, when you realize that detachment is not power, it's fear, you stop playing the role of the one trying to win them over. You stop assuming they're calm and unbothered and start recognizing they're just disconnected not only from you, but often from themselves. The moment that clicks, the whole dynamic shifts, because now you're not reacting to their behavior, you're observing it. You're not internalizing their withdrawal, you're understanding it. You realize their silence is not a mystery you need to solve. It's a pattern you can choose to no longer entertain. That's when their armor starts to crack. Because avoidants are used to being pursued. They're used to having someone try harder every time they pull away. But when you stop doing that, not out of bitterness, not to play games, but because you finally see the game, they're left without the reaction that feeds their avoidance. And that's when they crumble. A lot of people confuse emotional detachment with strength. They see someone who keeps their distance, who doesn't get flustered, who seems like nothing touches them, and they think, wow, that person's really in control. But here's something you need to understand if you ever want to reclaim your peace in relationships like this. Detachment isn't a sign of superiority. It's not emotional mastery. More often than not, it's a trauma response. It's someone's way of avoiding intimacy because somewhere along the line, closeness became unsafe. Avoidants aren't operating from a place of confidence, they're operating from fear. Fear of needing someone and being let down. Fear of letting someone in and losing control. Fear that if they allow themselves to truly be seen, it'll expose something they can't bear to face. So what do? They stay one step removed. They don't fully open up. They keep you guessing, and on the surface, that can look like they're just more grounded than you, more emotionally intelligent, more secure. But underneath that, there's often a deep discomfort with vulnerability. And when you finally understand that, you stop feeling less than. See, when you're the more emotionally available person, it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking they must be better at this than I am. You overanalyze your feelings. You wonder why you're the one who always seems to care more, reach out more, try harder. But that emotional openness, that's not weakness, that's capacity, that's strength. And the fact that you can feel deeply, express honestly, and show up even when it's hard, that's not something to be ashamed of. It's something they're afraid of. Avoidants often learned somewhere in their life that connection comes with danger, maybe rejection, maybe suffocation, maybe judgment, so they built emotional armor. But here's the twist. When you start to understand that their coldness is just a cover for fear, they stop being the one with all the control. Because now, you're no longer idolizing their distance, you're recognizing it, as a limitation. You stop seeing them as someone to impress and start seeing them as someone who hasn't yet done the emotional work that you have. And this is the part that really matters. When you stop putting their detachment on a pedestal, when you stop assuming their avoidant behavior means they're somehow above it all, they start to lose that invisible grip they had on you. Because now, you're not chasing their validation, you're assessing whether they even have the emotional range to meet you where you are. And that shift, that's what sets you free. Because nothing crumbles the avoidance illusion faster than someone who sees right through it. There's a moment, and if you've ever been in this dynamic, you'll know exactly what I mean when you realize you've been negotiating your worth the entire time. You don't see it at first, because it doesn't start like that. At the beginning, you're just trying to connect, to understand, to bridge the gap. But little by little, you start explaining yourself more than you should. You find yourself making excuses for their distance. You start thinking, if I just love them right, if I just show them how patient I am, how loyal I am, how much I care, maybe then they'll open up. But here's the hard truth. The avoidant doesn't change when you prove you're worthy of their love. They change when you remember you don't need to prove anything at all. This is the shift that turns everything on its head. When you base your self-worth on how someone else responds to you, especially someone who's wired to keep distance, you'll always be off balance. You'll always feel like you're auditioning for a role in their life, waiting to be chosen. And they feel that. Avoidance can sense when someone is emotionally outsourcing their value, and unfortunately, it often reinforces their instinct to pull away. Not because you're not good enough, but because the weight of your effort makes them feel pressure, and pressure is the very thing they're trying to avoid. But when you flip that script, when you stop trying to convince them and start acting from the place of I already know what I bring to the table, something powerful happens. You're no longer emotionally kneeling to their inconsistency. You're no longer treating their minimal effort like it's gold. You're not begging for clarity from someone who thrives in confusion. You're anchored, and when you're anchored, they feel it. They're used to emotional pursuit. They're not used to someone who can love deeply, yet still walk away when their needs aren't being met. That's when the ground beneath them starts to shake. Because the very dynamic they've come to expect where they pull away, and you try harder, suddenly isn't there anymore. You're not chasing, you're not questioning your value, you're not losing sleep over mixed signals. You've reclaimed your emotional space, and for someone who's built a whole strategy around emotional avoidance, that's unsettling. That's when they begin to feel what they were trying to avoid all along, the discomfort of realizing they're the ones who might be left behind. And if they are ever going to grow, that's the moment they have to face. But it only happens when you stop shrinking yourself to be chosen and start choosing yourself. Because when your self-worth is no longer up for negotiation, their control over the situation disappears. Something really powerful happens when you become emotionally available without being emotionally desperate. It's one of the most disarming things you can do around an avoidant. Because here's what they expect. They expect either pursuit or withdrawal. They're used to people chasing them, trying to crack the code, or, on the flip side, getting fed up and walking away without ever really understanding what's happening. What they aren't used to is someone showing up with calm emotional presence, staying grounded, and refusing to play the game. That throws them completely off. When you're consistent, clear, and emotionally present, you hold up a mirror to the avoidant, and that mirror is uncomfortable for them. Because now they can't hide behind the usual narratives that you're too much, that things are moving too fast, that they need space because you're overwhelming. All of that falls apart when you're not pressuring, not pushing, just calmly being there and saying, "This is where I am, this is how I feel, and I'm not here to chase you, I'm here to connect, if you're capable of showing up too." And they feel it. That steady presence exposes the emotional gaps they've been trying to avoid. It calls them out without ever having to say a word. Because the truth is, emotional availability is confronting to someone who's spent their whole life running from it. They've built an entire system around dodging intimacy, and now here you are, grounded, not chasing, not reacting, just standing in your truth. That makes them uncomfortable because it forces them to face something they usually run from. The idea that real connection requires effort, openness, and vulnerability. They don't get to blame you for chaos or drama because you're not bringing any. And when you stop feeding the story that you're the one who's too intense, too emotional, too eager, they start to feel the pressure of their own avoidance. That's when the excuses wear thin. That's when their behaviors, which used to feel like emotional strength, start to look like what they really are, defenses, outdated, rigid, and rooted in fear. But here's the beauty of it: when you don't collapse into their rhythm, you reclaim your own. You're no longer at the mercy of their hot hand, cold energy. You set the tone. You show what emotional maturity looks like without demanding they meet you there. And if they can't, you're strong enough to walk away, not out of frustration, but out of clarity. That's the kind of presence that unravels the avoidant, because it forces them to realize that their distance isn't power. It's the very thing pushing away the kind of connection they secretly crave. And once they feel that truth without you saying a word, the dynamic begins to break. One of the most liberating things you'll ever realize in this kind of dynamic is that real control isn't in trying harder, it's in letting go. And that can sound like a contradiction, especially if you've spent a lot of time believing that love means effort, or that if someone's pulling away, it must mean you need to do more. But what if I told you that the more you try to manage the connection, the more control you actually give away? Avoidants thrive in emotional uncertainty. That's their comfort zone, not because they enjoy hurting people or playing games, but because staying in control, staying uninvested, keeps them emotionally safe. And every time you jump through hoops to get closer to them, they learn that they don't have to change. They learn that the relationship will bend around their limitations. So they stay guarded, distant, and vague because it works. But something happens when you stop managing their discomfort, when you stop showing up with this quiet hope that maybe this time they'll open up. Instead of contorting yourself to make the relationship feel stable, you just stop. You stop chasing. You stop explaining your worth. You stop trying to predict their next move. Not because you don't care, but because you finally understand the game, and you're no longer willing to lose yourself inside of it. Letting go doesn't mean shutting down. It doesn't mean becoming cold or detached. It means choosing peace over confusion. It means saying, if this connection can't exist without me having to overfunction, then it's not the right connection. That shift doesn't come from anger, it comes from clarity. You start seeing that holding on tighter doesn't bring them closer. It just drags you deeper into the cycle, and the more you let go, the more grounded you become in your own value. And here's where it really flips, because avoidants are used to being the ones who control the pace. They're used to setting the emotional temperature of the relationship. But when you take a step back, when you calmly remove yourself from the tug-of-war, they're left holding the rope alone. And that's when things start to unravel, because now they're faced with something they're not prepared for, the absence of your energy. Avoidants often don't realize how much they've relied on your pursuit, your effort, your consistency until it's gone. They're not the ones who suddenly became less avoidant overnight. You just stopped reinforcing the cycle. You didn't try to fix it. You just let go of what was never yours to carry in the first place. And in that stillness, when you're no longer reaching, is where their patterns begin to fall apart. Avoidants operate in a fog, and they want you in it with them. That's how the dynamic stays alive. The confusion, the mixed signals, the almost Connection that never quite lands. It keeps you chasing something that always feels just out of reach. One day, they're warm, the next, they're distant. They say they want closeness, but then they disappear when it starts to happen. And because it never becomes clear, your brain stays locked in this loop of trying to figure them out. That's how they keep the upper hand, by keeping you uncertain. But here's the thing, the second clarity enters the room, the fog has nowhere to hide. And this is where the power begins to shift, not by forcing them to change, but by you seeing the pattern for what it is. When you name it, when you call it what it actually is, not love, not depth, but avoidance masked as mystery, everything starts to make sense. And once something makes sense, it loses its grip on you. Avoidants don't crumble when you scream at them. They don't crumble when you beg, or chase, or plead for answers. They crumble when you get quiet, internally quiet. When you stop looking to them for permission to feel what you already know. That clarity, that calm knowing, that I see exactly what this is energy, that's what makes their carefully controlled narrative start to unravel. Because here's the truth. Someone who thrives in ambiguity doesn't know what to do with someone who operates from clarity. When you're no longer confused, you're no longer controllable. You're no longer waiting around for them to give you something they don't even know how to give. You're not decoding their silences or trying to find meaning in breadcrumbs. You see the whole picture, and when you see the whole picture, you stop feeding the illusion, and you don't even have to make a big exit. You don't need to slam the door or deliver a dramatic speech. The most powerful moment is when you just stop participating. You don't match their avoidance with more confusion, you hold steady in truth. And in doing that, you force a confrontation they've been avoiding their entire life. The confrontation with themselves. Because now, the spotlight isn't on your reaction, it's on their inconsistency. And that's uncomfortable for someone who's built their identity around emotional distance. For the first time, they're faced with someone who sees the game and simply chooses not to play. That's when the silence gets loud. So when you finally understand the game, when you stop seeing their distance as strength and start seeing it as fear, everything changes. You stop chasing what was never emotionally available to begin with. You stop assigning meaning to silence. You stop shrinking yourself to earn what should be given freely. Instead, you step into clarity, self-worth, and emotional maturity, and that's the moment the avoidant begins to feel the weight of their own avoidance. This isn't about revenge. It's not about making anyone crumble out of spite. It's about you reclaiming your peace by no longer participating in a pattern that was never built to meet your emotional needs. The avoidant only ever had power when you didn't understand the dynamic, but now you do. And with that understanding comes choice to detach with grace, to show up with presence, and to never again abandon yourself just to stay close to someone who disappears the moment love gets real. When you know your worth, their distance no longer defines your value, and that's when everything begins to shift. So here's where it all lands. When you finally see the avoidant for who they are, not the version you romanticized, not the story you clung to, but the reality of their emotional limits, you stop waiting for change and start choosing yourself. You realize that love doesn't have to feel like uncertainty. It doesn't have to feel like silence, second guessing, or constantly trying to earn a place in someone's life. Love is clarity, it's consistency. It's two people meeting in the middle, not one person doing the emotional heavy lifting while the other hides behind fear. And when you stop giving energy to what drains you, when you stop chasing potential and start honoring reality, you become the one in control, not by force, but by presence. That quiet strength, that calm knowing of I deserve more than this, speaks louder than any emotional outburst ever could. The avoidant may crumble when faced with that kind of truth, or they may not. That part isn't yours to manage anymore. What is yours is the power to walk away from anything that asks you to abandon yourself. And in the end, that's what real self-respect looks like.